Hello, coming to you from the lively city of board gaming, Omaha, Nebraska. Welcome to the Out of the Dust podcast. I'm your host, Boisterous Bryce. Tied in with the popular recurring Out of the Dust Geek list on Board Game Geek, the Out of the Dust podcast is a weekly podcast that is focused on re-exploring games we play that we hadn't previously played in a year or more. Why did the game get dusty? Why did you decide to dust it off? How does the game compare to how you remembered it? Are you likely to play it more often in the future? These are the questions that we're interested in examining on Out of the Dust. This week on the podcast, episode 39. On the Out of the Dust segment, I'll bring Lunar Rails out of the dust, and a contributor will dust off both Odin's Ravens and RRR. On the reaction segment, I describe what might be the most legendarily inept Kickstarter I've ever seen. On the What I've Been Playing segment, I review Dinogenics. On the Obscure Bryce Game segment, I review Game of Gnomes. And we wrap up the episode by starting my top 5 favorite Kickstarter games countdown. I had a chance to bring Lunar Rails out of the dust recently. Published by Mayfair Games in 2013, Lunar Rails is part of the famed Crayon Rails series, train games in which players actually draw their rail lines on the board. As the name implies, in Lunar Rails, players build a system of train rails on the mood. I last played it 2 years, 2 months, and 7 days ago. There are a dozen Crayon Rail titles in the series, and because my preferred play style for this series is to cycle through all the maps before repeating them, they tend to get dusty between plays. But it has been an abnormally long time for Lunar Rails. The designer, M. Robert Strabula, also designed the Martian Rails map in the series. Both these maps are among the most interesting. But after playing Lunar Rails again, I still think it is the toughest map in the series. That mountainous dark side of the moon is just absolutely brutal. My wife and I had an amazingly close game that was back and forth the whole game, and I just barely sneaked a victory out a turn ahead of her. It was a very satisfying play, and the sort of play that makes me want to get back into playing Crayon Rails more often. Let's see what a contributor brought out of the dust. Francis McGregor, username Zafil, brought a pair of fun games out of the dust. First up was the first edition of Odin's Ravens, a 2002 card game published by Cosmos from designer Thorsten Gimler of No Thanks fame. Francis last played it 4 years, 2 months, and 21 days ago. He writes, I pulled this off the shelf to see if I should cull it or not. The answer is nope! I had a really enjoyable game with my friend, and it made me remember why I picked this game up in the first place. I like how, even though it's a race game, it's played over multiple games. So if you get hosed in one game, you still have a chance to win. I also like how if you think your opponent is going to win the current race, it's time to even points out with the Magic Way. In fact, it's a good idea to keep an eye on that Magic Way because you could win, but still lose the round. I love the auxiliary stack and how you can stash cards there for later. I'm sad that they changed the rules for the second edition to simplify things. Next out of the dust was RRR, which stands for Regality versus Religion Revolution, a 2010 abstract strategy game published by Japan Brand and designed by Seiji Kanai and Hayato Kisaragi, who also did Lost Legacy together. Francis last played it 4 years, 7 months, and 22 days ago. It currently rates it a 10 out of 10. He writes, I can't believe it's been almost 5 years since I've played this. It's quick and fun, and every tile has special powers. And then you add in the neutral tiles, and things go bonkers! I didn't get to play with the neutral tiles in my Dusted Off play, but they're coming in the next one. It's a crime that this game wasn't picked up in English. I have a lot of good 2-player-only games that are in need of a reprint. Is the market for them so small? A good question, Francis, and thanks for the contribution. I suspect the market is more crowded than small, but RRR sounds like an interesting game. I'd not heard of it before, but this sounds like a cool game I'll give a try to if the opportunity ever presents itself. Reaction segment time. As someone who follows board games seeking crowdfunding, I, like many others, became caught up in the epic drama of the Game of Thrones card game Kickstarter this last week. Over the years, certain names and Kickstarter projects have gone down in infamy for one reason or another. The most legendary is probably Molly Friedrich's Catalika project, the failure of which was blamed on the insidious influence of the sun. But after this last week, the name of Daniel Perez is sure to go down as a rival to the title of most infamous project ever. It's a drama so epic in its inept and tragic scope it's going to take me more than one episode to recount it all. Here's how it started. A jeweler from Connecticut by the name of Daniel Perez decided it would be a great idea to launch a Game of Thrones themed card game, a game he claimed was the first ever Game of Thrones card game. Obviously, this is a ridiculous statement, and early observers of the campaign were quick to point out the fallacy with it. Despite Daniel's assurances he had permission from HBO to use the IP, these same early observers were also skeptical and quick to suggest to Daniel that no, he probably didn't have the permission he thought he did. One guy even reached out to the HBO authority that Daniel named and got a response back from him saying he had given no such permission. I pointed out that Daniel was a jeweler because Daniel himself thought this was an important bit of information everyone should know. The campaign page even had a picture of his shop as proof of his legitimate business acumen. Unfortunately for Daniel, the campaign page was also rife with grammatical errors, including misspellings of multiple main characters' names. The How to Play video was a joke that featured a poorly printed game board, the most eye-glaringly atrocious graphic design you've ever seen for the cards, and a rules explanation that made it plain the game was being made up on the fly. The backer pledge levels were completely ridiculous, and in addition to promising the cheapest copies of game you've ever heard of, also promised signed memorabilia from Game of Thrones cast members. The whole presentation created a debate amongst backers about whether this campaign was a purposeful scam or an astounding display of board game and Kickstarter ignorance, amateurism, and ineptitude. I myself came down in the latter camp. The campaign was too fantastic and poorly thought out to be a purposeful scam. Any backer who took the campaign seriously would undoubtedly become scammed, but that would just be a convenient side effect of Daniel's cluelessness. But whatever his questionable motivation, the campaign quickly attracted hundreds of dollar backers, including myself, who proceeded to have a big mocking party in the comments section at Daniel's expense. One observer, an aspiring game designer like myself, questioned whether it was appropriate to make fun of a campaign instead of encouraging the creator, but it should be pointed out that in the early hours of the campaign, there were many people who were genuinely trying to give Daniel helpful advice about how to improve his game and his campaign. The local game design organization that I am the chairman of, the Spielmasons, has a founding principle: honest feedback is the most helpful feedback, and sometimes it's okay to just say no to a game idea. Sometimes it's as important to save the world from a bad design as it is to help a promising design along the way. There was no doubt that the Game of Thrones card game was a bad design, and there wasn't even the slightest sliver of promise in even a rethemed idea. But it was at the height of the frivolity in the comment section that a discovery was made, and the campaign suddenly took a very dark and disturbing turn. And that's where we'll pick up the narrative of this saga next week. On the What I've Been Playing segment this week, I'm going to tell you about Dinogenics, the recent Kickstarter-fulfilled dinosaur park management-themed worker placement game from designer Richard Keene and publisher Ninth Haven Games. You may recall that Dinogenics had the misfortune of initially launching their campaign shortly after the original Dinosaur Island Kickstarter, which unfairly gave Dinogenics a copycat label from some at the time. It was an issue that I could sympathize with myself because I'd totally been developing my own dinosaur park game for a couple of years at that time, and wound up scrapping that design because someone else had essentially beaten me to the punch. Indeed, the copycat criticism was so troublesome for Dinogenics that Ninth Haven wound up canceling their Kickstarter and relaunching at a later date. I did not back Dinogenics at the time, though as a dinosaur-themed fanatic I was tempted. But money was tight at the time, and I'd already backed one dinosaur park management-themed game from a more reputable publisher, so I decided to take a wait-and-see approach to Dinogenics. The game took a long time to fulfill. In fact, Dinosaur Island had time to launch and fulfill an expansion in the meantime. But finally fulfill it did, and positive reviews began to roll in. And since I am such a dinosaur-themed fanatic, I decided to try and acquire a copy myself on the secondary market. Reasonably priced copies were scarce, but fortunately Ninth Haven had a small stock of leftover copies that they decided to sell on their website after fulfillment was done, and I was one of the fortunate people who scored one of the 200 leftover copies allocated for North America. Here's how the game works. Players use workers to claim action spaces, most of which revolve around set collecting DNA cards and trading in those cards for dinosaurs to place in their personal park board. There are also spots to acquire and play Lords of Waterdeep intrigue-esque manipulation cards, spots to get goats to feed to carnivores, and spots to build fences, motels to hold visitors, and various kinds of installations, each of which grant players different kinds of special abilities. Creating dinosaurs, building additional hotels, and erecting installations all grant players victory points in various quantities. Dinosaurs are the most lucrative way to earn points, as players score points each round for the dinosaurs in their park, which means a dinosaur created early in the game will continue to yield points every single round. After a set number of rounds, the game ends. Players earn points for the number of different species in their park, and whoever winds up with the most points becomes the most successful dinosaur park manager and wins the game. Now, despite the publisher's desires, it continues to be inevitable that Dinogenics gets compared to Dinosaur Island. Usually, I'm not a fan of comparing games and believe that many of the popular comparisons that currently exist shouldn't. But you know what? It makes sense in this case. Dinosaur Island obviously shares the same theme, but remarkably for games that were developed independently of each other, these two games also share some striking mechanic similarities as well. Besides each being a worker placement game, some of the fine details are also similar. Both games have a mechanic for dealing with the threat that the dinosaurs pose, the penalty of each which results in dead visitors and lost points. The visitors in each game grant both income and points. Players in each game can customize their park with the dinosaurs they want, and the special abilities granted by various elements. So, which game is better? I'm not sure yet. I haven't had a chance to play Dinogenics as much as Dinosaur Island, but my initial reaction is that it's at least as good. The worker placement is a little cleaner in Dinosaur Island, and I'd give a slight edge in park customization to Dinosaur Island as well. But I think the card-based set collection mechanic of making the dinosaurs in Dinogenics is more interesting than the DNA dice mechanic of Dinosaur Island. Typically, I'm the sort of person who will suggest someone get or keep two similarly themed games if they're trying to decide which one to go with. But because of the additional mechanical similarities of both Dinosaur Island and Dinogenics, I wouldn't talk someone out of keeping just one of the two. As for me, since dinosaurs are my favorite theme, I am going to keep both of these in my collection. I'm having a really fun time with both games right now. Each year around my birthday, which is later in May, I pick a game to demo and theme a birthday cake around it. My wife is a cake decorator and indulges this annual request of mine. Just because Dinogenics is newer and because I like the art style better, I'm going to theme my birthday cake around it this year. I'll post a pic of that when it happens. Obscure Bryce Game segment time. This week on the segment, I'm going to tell you about Game of Gnomes, the 2015 release from designers the Lamont Brothers and their company Fragger Games. Up until Game of Gnomes, the Lamont Brothers were steadily publishing one game per year, trying to outdo each of their previous releases in terms of table presence and the most impressive components you've ever seen. They haven't actually released anything since Game of Gnomes and are still supposedly working on a Wallace and Gromit game. But many of their games have had components featured on various top 10 most ludicrous game pieces, and similar lists of that sort. Though Game of Gnomes features beautifully detailed resin gnomes as part of the package, its most well-known component is the three-dimensional foot-high mountain that the gnomes get to climb during the game. Here's how the game works. Game of Gnomes is an action point allowance and time management pick-up and deliver game in which each player is a gnome traveling around the board and mountain picking mushrooms to sell at various locations for gems. Gems can be spent on equipment like larger baskets to hold more mushrooms, or backpacks that increase hand size, but are also points at the end of the game. During their turn, players play terrain cards to traverse the map, pick and sell mushrooms, shop for goods, and go on quests for a sorcerer, all of these actions of which cost certain amounts of time.